At precisely 3:47 in the morning on April 9, 1943, two German military trains carrying over 600 soldiers and enough ammunition to level a small city collided head-on at full speed in the heart of occupied Belgium. The impact was so violent that the lead locomotives telescoped into each other, creating a fireball visible from 15 kilometers away. Metal shrieked against metal as railcars accordion folded and exploded in a cascade of secondary detonations that shook the windows of nearby villages. When the smoke cleared and rescue teams arrived at dawn, they found a scene of absolute carnage. Twisted steel, burning cargo, and the bodies of Nazi soldiers scattered across 200 meters of obliterated railway. German High Command was baffled. How could two trains on the same track, moving toward each other, both believe they had the right of way? The investigation would take weeks, but the answer was far simpler and far more brilliant than anyone could have imagined. A single man, armed with nothing but a screwdriver and intimate knowledge of clockwork mechanisms, had turned an entire railway station into a weapon. Belgium in 1943 was a nation suffocating under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. 3 years had passed since German tanks rolled across the border, and the country had been transformed into a critical supply artery for Hitler's war machine. The railway system, once the pride of Belgian engineering, now served as the nervous system of the occupation, moving troops, weapons, and stolen resources toward the Eastern Front. Every station, every switch, every signal was now controlled by German railway officers who ran the system with Prussian precision. Curfews were absolute, resistance was met with mass executions, and collaboration was rewarded with food rations. The Belgian people lived in a state of controlled terror, watching their country being used as a highway for horror. But beneath the surface of compliance in workshops and backrooms and quiet conversations, a different Belgium was stirring. A Belgium that refused to accept that ordinary people were powerless against an army that had conquered a continent. In the town of Leuven, 30 kilometers east of Brussels, there was a man who had spent his entire adult life doing one thing extraordinarily well. Henri Bosmans was 46 years old, and for 28 of those years, he had been the master clockmaker at the Central Railway Station. His workshop, tucked into a corner of the station's second floor, was a universe of gears and springs and pendulums. Henri could disassemble a pocket watch blindfolded and reassemble it with the precision of a surgeon. But his true masterpiece was the station itself. Every clock on every platform, every timepiece in every office, every schedule board that dictated when trains arrived and departed, all of them synchronized to a master clock that Henri had built with his own hands. The German officers who now ran the station had no idea that the entire temporal framework of their operation depended on one quiet Belgian man who climbed ladders and oiled mechanisms and asked no questions. They saw him as part of the furniture, as invisible as the walls. Henri lived alone in a small apartment above a bakery that no longer had flour to make bread. His wife had died of pneumonia 2 winters before the invasion, and his only son, a university student, had been arrested in 1940 for distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets and sent to a labor camp somewhere in Germany. Henri had received one letter, heavily censored, and then nothing. The silence had hollowed him out, transforming grief into something colder and more patient. He went to work every day, wound the clocks, adjusted the mechanisms, and said nothing to anyone. The Germans thought he was broken, compliant, defeated. They were wrong. Henri had been studying the railway schedule with the intensity of a chess master analyzing a board. He knew which trains carried troops, which carried ammunition, which routes were critical to the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front. And he had noticed something that no German officer had considered. The entire system's coordination depended on synchronized time. If the clocks lied, the railway would believe the lie. The idea came to him on a Sunday in late March, during a mandatory inspection of the station's main clock tower. A young German lieutenant, barely old enough to shave, had accompanied him up the narrow stairs, smoking a cigarette and complaining about the tedium of occupation duty. The officer had made an offhand comment about how 2 supply trains would be passing through Leuven in opposite directions the following month, a logistical challenge requiring split-second timing. Henri had nodded politely, adjusted a gear, and said nothing. But in that moment, Standing in the clock tower with the mechanical heartbeat of the station ticking around him, he saw the entire plan unfold like the gears of a watch revealing their purpose. It would require precision, patience, and a willingness to accept that he would almost certainly be caught and executed. Henri climbed down from the tower that afternoon and began to plan the most important repair work of his life. The weapon was already in his hands, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone brave enough to use it. Every clock in the station was connected through a system of synchronized mechanisms, all answering to the master timepiece that only Henri could access. The German railway officers checked their schedules against these clocks constantly, trusting them with the absolute faith that German engineering demanded. But Henri understood something fundamental about systems built on precision. The more perfect the system, the more catastrophic the failure when one small component is deliberately sabotaged. All he needed to do was wait for the right night, the right trains, and the courage to turn 28 years of craftsmanship into 28 minutes of calculated chaos. The clock was ticking, and Henri Bosmans was about to stop being invisible. The opportunity presented itself with the cold bureaucratic efficiency that defined every aspect of the Nazi occupation. On April 5th, a revised railway schedule was posted in the station master's office, and Henri, who cleaned the clocks in that office every Tuesday morning, studied it with the focused attention of a man reading his own death warrant. 2 military transport trains were scheduled to pass through Leuven Station on April 9th, travelling in opposite directions on the same main line. The first train, designated Transport 73 Alpha, would depart from Brussels at 2:30 in the morning, heading east toward the German border, carrying fresh troops for the collapsing Eastern Front. The second train, Transport 91 Bravo, would leave Liège at 2:45, travelling west with ammunition and artillery shells being redistributed to coastal defences. The trains would pass each other at exactly 3:15 in the morning at a switching point 20 kilometres east of Leuven, where the single-track line briefly split to allow opposing traffic. The margin for error was 0. If either train was even 3 minutes off schedule, they would meet on a section of track where there was no switch, no siding, no escape. Henri spent the next 3 days moving through the station like a ghost, maintaining his routine so perfectly that no one noticed the slight changes in his pattern. He oiled clocks that did not need oiling, adjusted mechanisms that were already perfect, and most importantly, he studied the overnight schedule with obsessive detail. The night shift consisted of only 2 German officers, Lieutenant Hauptmann Klaus Weber, who managed the dispatch office, and Sergeant Otto Krause, who monitored the signal controls. Both men were creatures of absolute habit. Weber ate his dinner at exactly 8 o'clock in the station canteen, then worked in his office until midnight, before taking a 30-minute break to smoke in the rail yard. Krause remained at his post, but had developed a predictable pattern of falling asleep between 2 and 4 in the morning when train traffic was at its lowest. Henri had watched this routine for months, never imagining he would use the information for anything more than idle observation. Now, these small human weaknesses in the German precision machine were the gaps through which he would strike. The technical challenge was more complex than simply moving clock hands forward. The station operated on a coordinated system where every timepiece had to match within 30 seconds of the master clock, or alarm bells would sound in the dispatch office, alerting officers to a synchronization failure. Henri could not simply walk into the station at midnight and spin every clock forward by 15 minutes. The change had to be gradual, invisible, and distributed across the entire system in a way that would not trigger any warnings. He would need to access the master clock mechanism in the tower and adjust its regulator, the small weighted pendulum that controlled the speed at which the gears advanced. By increasing the swing rate by just 2%, he could make every clock in the station run faster without any single timepiece appearing to malfunction. Over the course of 6 hours, 2% faster would accumulate to almost 7.5 minutes of gained time. It would not be enough alone, but combined with manual adjustments to key clocks in the dispatch and signal offices during the brief windows when they were unwatched, he could create a 15-minute gap between what the clock said and what reality demanded. The moral weight of what he was planning pressed against Henri's chest every waking moment, making it difficult to breathe, difficult to sleep, Difficult to pretend that he was still the harmless old clockmaker who wanted nothing more than to survive the occupation, and perhaps one day receive another letter from his son. 600 German soldiers would be on those trains. 600 men, some of them barely older than his own boy, who had been conscripted into a war they might not even believe in. Henri spent hours trying to construct a moral framework that would allow him to live with what he was about to do. He failed. There was no framework, no justification, no equation that balanced out the mathematics of deliberate mass death. But every time his resolve weakened, he would remember the last words in his son's censored letter, the only sentence the Nazi censors had allowed through. "Papa, do not let them make you forget who you are." Henri understood now that his son was not asking him to survive. He was asking him to resist. On the night of April 8th, Henri Bosmans ate dinner alone in his apartment, a thin soup made from potato peels and water. He bathed, shaved with a straight razor that had belonged to his father, and dressed in his best shirt. He wrote no letter, left no confession, created no evidence that would implicate anyone else in what was about to happen. At 11:45, he walked through the empty streets of Leuven under curfew, carrying only his leather tool case and a keyring that granted him access to every locked door in the railway station. The spring air was cold, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the rumble of a freight train passing through on a different line. Henri did not pray. He had stopped believing in God sometime during the occupation. But he believed in gears, in springs, in the absolute reliability of mechanical systems. And tonight, he would teach the Germans that even the most perfect machine could be turned against its masters by someone who truly understood how it worked. The station at midnight was a cathedral of shadows and mechanical breathing, the kind of space that existed in the gap between the world of the living and the world of the sleeping. Henri entered through the maintenance entrance on the north side, his key turning in the lock, with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. The main hall stretched before him, empty platforms gleaming under dim emergency lighting that the Germans kept burning all night to prevent sabotage. The irony was not lost on Henri. He moved slowly, deliberately, his footsteps echoing against the vaulted ceiling as he made his way toward the clock tower staircase. Every sound was amplified in the emptiness, the distant hum of electrical generators, the ticking of 24 synchronized clocks, the occasional hiss of steam from heating pipes. He had walked these halls thousands of times, but tonight every detail felt sharp and final, as if he were seeing the station for the last time. He probably was. The master clock occupied the highest point of the station, a room barely 3 meters square at the top of 82 spiral stairs. Henri climbed slowly, his tool case growing heavier with each step. His breathing labored not from exertion but from the weight of what he was about to set in motion. The room smelled of machine oil and old wood, familiar scents that had defined his adult life. The master mechanism dominated the space, a beautiful construction of brass gears and iron weights, its pendulum swinging in perfect rhythm like the heartbeat of time itself. This clock controlled every timepiece in the station through a series of electrical pulses sent every 60 seconds, synchronizing the entire system. Henri set down his tool case and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were the tools of his trade: screwdrivers, calipers, small bottles of oil, jeweler's magnifying glasses, and one item that did not belong, a small adjustable wrench that he would use to alter the regulator weight. The change would be microscopic, invisible to anyone who did not know exactly what to look for. He began to work. Adjusting the master clock's regulator required absolute precision and an understanding of harmonic mechanics that few people in occupied Europe possessed. Henri removed the glass casing and exposed the pendulum assembly, then carefully loosened the regulator nut that held the timing weight in position. By sliding the weight upward along the pendulum rod by exactly 4 millimeters, he would decrease the pendulum's effective length and increase its swing frequency. The clock would run faster, but not so fast that anyone glancing at it would notice the acceleration. The change would accumulate gradually, invisibly across hours. Henri made the adjustment with the steady hands of a man who had spent 3 decades performing microsurgery on timepieces, then tightened the nut and replaced the casing. He checked his pocket watch, a beautiful piece he had made himself in 1931 and noted the time, 12:23 in the morning. By 6 o'clock, the station clocks would be running 7.5 minutes fast. It was a start, but not enough. He needed to manually adjust the clocks in the dispatch office and the signal control room to push the gap to 15 minutes. Lieutenant Weber's office was on the ground floor, directly adjacent to the main dispatch board, where train movements were coordinated and logged. Henri had perhaps 5 minutes to work before Weber returned from his midnight smoke break in the rail yard. The office clock was mounted on the wall behind Weber's desk, a large institutional timepiece with a white face and black Roman numerals. Henri entered the office with his heart hammering against his ribs, closed the door behind him, and pulled a chair beneath the clock. Standing on the chair made him feel exposed and ridiculous, a 46-year-old man playing at sabotage like a child playing at war. But his hands remained steady as he opened the clock's face and manually advanced the minute hand forward by 7.5 minutes, bringing it into alignment with where the master clock would be in 6 hours. The deception was now layered. The dispatch office clock showed a time that matched where the accelerated master clock would eventually arrive, creating the illusion of perfect synchronization. Anyone checking the time in this office after 6 in the morning would see a clock that appeared to be running normally, never suspecting that it was living in a future that had not yet arrived. The signal control room was the final and most dangerous target. Sergeant Krauss was stationed there, and while Henri knew the man usually dozed between 2 and 4 in the morning, it was now only 12:47. Henri would have to wait, hidden somewhere in the station, for over an hour before he could make his move. He retreated to the maintenance closet on the second floor, a cramped space filled with cleaning supplies and spare parts, and sat on an upturned bucket in the darkness. Time moved with agonizing slowness, each minute feeling like an hour, as Henri listened to the station's nighttime symphony, distant footsteps, the occasional rumble of a freight train passing through on a parallel track, the relentless ticking of clocks that were now lying to everyone who consulted them. At 2:15, Henri emerged from the closet and made his way toward the signal control room, moving through shadows like a man who had already accepted that he was a ghost. Through the room's window, he could see Krauss slumped in his chair, head tilted back, mouth open in sleep. Henri opened the door with infinite care and stepped inside to finish what he had started. The signal control room was smaller than Henri remembered, barely large enough for the massive mechanical board that dominated one wall and the desk where Sergeant Krauss now slept with the abandon of a man who believed himself safe in the heart of occupied territory. The board itself was a masterwork of German engineering, a complex array of switches, levers and indicator lights that controlled every signal and track switch for 40 kilometers in all directions. Green lights indicated clear tracks, red lights showed occupied sections, and yellow lights warned of trains approaching switching points. Right now at 2:17 in the morning, the board showed mostly green with 2 yellow indicators, marking the expected paths of the morning's supply trains that were still hours away from departure. Henri stood in the doorway, his tool case in one hand, watching Krauss's chest rise and fall with the rhythm of deep sleep. The clock on the wall above the board showed 2:17, synchronized with the lying master clock that was now running approximately 4 minutes fast. Henri needed to advance this clock by an additional 7.5 minutes to complete the deception. Moving across the room required the kind of careful silence that only terror can teach. Henri placed each foot with the deliberation of a man crossing a frozen lake, testing his weight before committing, breathing through his nose to avoid any sound that might wake the sleeping sergeant. Krauss shifted in his chair, muttering something in German that might have been a name or a dream, and Henri froze completely, becoming a statue among the mechanical landscape of switches and dials. 15 seconds passed. 30. Krauss settled back into sleep, and Henri resumed his glacial progress toward the wall clock. He was halfway across the room when his tool case brushed against the edge of the desk with a soft scraping sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the silence. Krauss stirred again, his head rolling to one side, and Henri's entire body tensed for the inevitable moment of discovery, for the shout of alarm, for the end of everything. But the sergeant merely smacked his lips, scratched his neck, and continued sleeping. Henri had forgotten how to breathe. The clock was mounted high on the wall, requiring Henri to stand on Kraus's desk to reach it, a position that felt suicidally exposed. He climbed onto the desk surface with the aching slowness of a man 3 times his age, his joints protesting, his balance uncertain. From this height, he could see the detail of the control board more clearly, could read the labels on each switch and lever, could understand the terrible elegance of the system he was about to sabotage. Each train had a designated time slot, a precise window when it was expected to occupy specific sections of track. The control room received updates every 15 minutes from dispatch offices up and down the line, confirming that trains were on schedule. If Transport 73 Alpha and Transport 91 Bravo both appeared to be running on time according to their local clocks, no one would question the schedule. No one would suspect that the clocks themselves were weapons. Henri opened the clock face with a small screwdriver, his hands surprisingly steady despite the absurdity of his position, and began to manually advance the minute hand forward. Moving the hand required care because the clock was connected to the station's electrical synchronization system, and any sudden movement could trigger a lag alarm. Henri advanced the minute hand slowly, 1 minute at a time, pausing between each movement to ensure no warning lights appeared on the control board. 7.5 minutes felt like an eternity. With each click of the hand moving forward, he was pushing the station further into a false future, creating a temporal gap between what the clocks claimed and what reality demanded. By the time he finished, the signal control room clock showed 2:29 when the actual time was only 2:21 and 30 seconds. The deception was complete. Every clock that mattered in the station was now running approximately 15 minutes fast. When the dispatch offices in Brussels and Liège sent their trains forward at 2:30 and 2:45 respectively, they would be consulting clocks that told the truth. But when those trains reported their positions to Leuven Station, the controllers here would check their own clocks and believe the trains were running behind schedule, never realizing that time itself had been weaponized against them. Henri climbed down from the desk with legs that felt like water, his entire body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. Kraus continued to sleep, oblivious to the fact that a Belgian clockmaker had just turned his control room into the trigger mechanism for a catastrophe. Henri moved toward the door, each step feeling like a small victory, his mind already calculating the timeline. At 3 o'clock station time, which would actually be 2:45, Transport 73 Alpha would report passing through the checkpoint west of Leuven. The signal controller on duty, checking the falsely advanced clock, would clear the track ahead, believing the eastbound train had plenty of time before the westbound Transport 91 Bravo entered the single track section. But Transport 91 Bravo would also be reporting on time according to its own truthful clocks, and by the time anyone realized the trains were converging on the same section of track with no switching point between them, it would be too late for either engineer to stop. Henri reached the door, turned for one last look at the sleeping sergeant and the board of lying lights, and stepped out into the corridor. He had 3 hours until the collision, 3 hours to disappear into the morning darkness, 3 hours to become the ghost he had always been. Henri did not go home. Going home would have meant waiting, and waiting would have meant thinking, and thinking would have destroyed what little resolve he had left. Instead, he walked through the silent streets of Leuven toward the eastern edge of town, where the railway line curved through a stretch of farmland before disappearing into the forest. He knew this section of track intimately because he had walked it dozens of times during his younger years when he had been courting his wife, and she had lived in a farmhouse near the switching station. That switching station was 8 kilometers east of Leuven, the place where the single track line briefly split to allow opposing trains to pass each other safely. It was also the last point where either train could be diverted to a siding if anyone realized the clocks were lying. Henri reached a small hill overlooking the tracks at 3 o'clock in the morning, according to his pocket watch, which meant it was actually 3:15 according to the station clocks that were now controlling the fate of 1,200 tons of steel and 600 human lives. He sat down on the cold ground and waited for the mathematics of time and distance to resolve themselves into fire and metal. The night was clear enough that Henri could see stars, though the moon had already set, leaving the landscape bathed in that particular darkness that exists only in the hour before dawn. He could hear the countryside waking around him, a dog barking in a distant farm, the wind moving through new spring leaves, the call of an early bird that had not yet learned that the world was at war. And then, beneath these sounds, he heard something else. A low rumble, distant but growing, the unmistakable sound of a heavy locomotive pushing through the night at full speed. Henri's chest tightened. Transport 73 Alpha, the eastbound train from Brussels, was approaching. He could see its headlight now, a single bright point moving along the track from the west, its beam cutting through the darkness like a lance. The train was massive, at least 15 cars long, its engine pulling hard as it accelerated through the flat countryside. In the locomotive cabin, the engineer would be checking his schedule, consulting his pocket watch, believing he was running slightly behind, and pushing the engine to make up time. He had no idea that the clocks at Leuven Station had given him clearance based on a timeline that existed only in brass gears and lying hands. Henri strained his eyes toward the east, searching the darkness for the second headlight that would signal the approach of Transport 91 Bravo from Liège. For a terrible moment, he thought perhaps he had miscalculated. Perhaps the westbound train had been delayed or cancelled. Perhaps he had committed his sabotage for nothing. Then he saw it, a pinprick of light far to the east, growing brighter with each passing second. Two trains, each moving at approximately 80 kilometers per hour, each believing they had exclusive right-of-way on a single stretch of track, each carrying enough explosive material to ensure that any collision would be catastrophic. Henri did the mathematics in his head with the precision of a man who had spent his life measuring time and distance. They would meet somewhere near the base of this hill in approximately 4 minutes. At that distance, even if both engineers saw each other and applied emergency brakes immediately, the physics of momentum and steel would make collision inevitable. The trains were already committed to their trajectories, locked into paths that would intersect with the finality of equations resolved. The headlights grew brighter, 2 stars approaching each other across the dark canvas of Belgian farmland, and Henri realized he was holding his breath. Part of him wanted to stand up, to run down the hill screaming and waving his arms like a madman, to somehow warn the engineers that they were racing toward each other at combined speed that would turn their locomotives into bombs. But he remained frozen on the hill, paralyzed by the understanding that he had set this in motion, that somewhere in those approaching trains were men who would die because a clockmaker had decided that the mathematics of resistance required sacrifice. The sound grew louder, the rumble of 2 massive engines now distinct and separate, each vibration traveling through the earth and into Henri's bones. He could see details now, the smoke trailing from both locomotives, the dark shapes of freight cars behind them, the slight sway of the cars as they moved over joints in the track. And then, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything changed. The first whistle blast came from the eastbound train, a long, sustained scream that cut through the night like a wound. The engineer had seen the westbound headlight. 3 seconds later, the westbound train answered with its own whistle, a sound of pure panic and disbelief. Both engineers were now pulling their emergency brake levers, locking the wheels, creating showers of sparks as steel ground against steel in a desperate attempt to defy physics. But steel moving at speed has momentum that cannot be denied, has mass that cannot be unmade. Henri watched the headlights continue their approach, slower now but still moving, still converging, locked into a geometry that would resolve itself in fire. The sound of the brakes was like the screaming of metal animals, high-pitched and terrible, joined now by the secondary sounds of cargo shifting, of cars buckling against each other as the sudden deceleration compressed the train like an accordion. And then, at precisely 3:47 in the morning, the 2 locomotives met at the base of the hill, in an impact that transformed night into day. The collision happened in layers, each one distinct and terrible, unfolding over the course of perhaps 5 seconds, that contained more violence than Henri had witnessed in his entire life. The lead locomotives struck first, nose to nose at a combined closing speed of nearly 90 kilometers per hour, despite the emergency braking. The impact crumpled both engine fronts like paper, driving steel into steel with such force that the boilers ruptured simultaneously, releasing superheated steam and water in explosive detonations that lit the countryside with hellish orange light. The sound was beyond anything Henri could have imagined. Not a single crash, but a sustained roar of destruction as the following cars telescoped forward, each one ramming into the wreckage ahead with enough force to lift entire freight cars off the rails. Henri watched as a cargo car loaded with artillery shells flipped completely over, hung suspended in the air for an impossible moment, then slammed down onto its side and began to slide along the gravel embankment in a shower of sparks. The ammunition inside cooked off in a chain reaction, each explosion triggering the next, transforming the overturned car into a horizontal fountain of fire. The secondary explosions came quickly, each one larger than the last as the fire spread through both trains and found more fuel to consume. A fuel car near the middle of the eastbound train split open like a rotten fruit, spilling diesel across the wreckage and igniting in a fireball that rose 30 meters into the air. The heat was intense enough that Henri felt it on his face, even from his position on the hill 200 meters away. A wave of warmth that turned the cold spring night into something that felt like standing near an open furnace. More ammunition detonated, heavy caliber shells that had been destined for coastal defense guns, each explosion sending shrapnel whistling through the air and punching holes in surrounding cars. Henri could see shapes moving in the wreckage, soldiers who had survived the initial impact trying to crawl free from the twisted metal, their silhouettes backlit by flames as they stumbled and fell and sometimes did not rise again. He wanted to look away but could not, held paralyzed by the weight of what his hands had created, by the understanding that every scream and every secondary explosion was a consequence that bore his name. The fire spread with terrifying speed, feeding on diesel and wood and cloth and human fat, creating a conflagration that turned the crash site into a beacon visible for kilometers in every direction. Henri could hear the sounds of dying men now, screams that cut through even the roar of flames and exploding ammunition, sounds that would live in his memory like splinters driven too deep to ever be removed. He told himself these were Nazi soldiers, men who had participated in occupation and murder and the machinery of genocide, men whose deaths would save Belgian lives and disrupt supply lines that fed the war machine. But the screams did not sound like the screams of abstract enemies or political symbols. They sounded like the screams of young men who wanted their mothers, who had not expected to die on a railway track in Belgium, who had believed the clocks when the clocks had lied. Henri found himself weeping without sound, tears running down his face as he bore witness to his own creation, unable to leave and unable to bear staying. The entire massacre lasted perhaps 12 minutes from initial impact to the moment when the last major explosion rippled through the wreckage and the fires began to settle into the grim work of consuming what remained. Henri heard the distant sound of fire bells from Leuven, emergency crews mobilizing to respond to a disaster they could see burning from the town center. Soon German officers would arrive, would begin the investigation, would search for explanations, they would examine the wreckage, interview survivors if any remained conscious enough to speak, review the schedules and time logs. Eventually, someone would notice the discrepancies in the clocks, would realize that the station timepieces had been running fast, would begin to ask questions about who had access to the master clock mechanism. Henri had perhaps hours before his workshop was searched, before soldiers came to his apartment with questions and weapons. He should run, should disappear into the Belgian countryside and try to reach the resistance networks that operated in the forests. But he found he could not move from the hill, could not tear his eyes away from the burning trains. As dawn began to break in the east, painting the sky with colors that should have been beautiful, but felt obscene against the backdrop of the burning wreckage, Henri finally stood on unsteady legs. His back ached from sitting on the cold ground, and his face was wet with tears and smoke residue. Below him, the crash site had transformed from a scene of active destruction into something more settled and terrible, a landscape of twisted metal and smoldering fires and bodies that would take days to identify and weeks to properly count. Henri had destroyed 2 trains, killed hundreds of German soldiers, and disrupted a critical supply line to the Eastern Front. He had struck a blow for resistance that would be studied and analyzed and perhaps even celebrated if the Allies ever learned what had happened here. But standing on that hill as morning arrived, Henri Bosmans felt no triumph, no satisfaction, no sense that justice had been served. He felt only the crushing weight of what it meant to choose violence, even righteous violence, even necessary violence. He felt like a man who had opened a door that could never be closed again. Henri returned to his apartment as the sun climbed above the rooftops of Leuven, walking through streets that were beginning to stir with early morning activity. Shopkeepers opened shutters on stores that had nothing to sell. Women queued at the bakery, hoping for the day's meager ration of bread. And somewhere in the distance, the wail of emergency sirens continued as rescue crews worked at the crash site. Nobody looked at Henri as he passed. He was invisible again, just another tired man in worn clothes making his way home after a long night. He climbed the stairs to his apartment above the bakery, unlocked the door with hands that still trembled, and sat down at his small kitchen table without removing his coat. The apartment was exactly as he had left it the night before, the bowl from his soup dinner still in the sink, his bed unmade, his dead wife's photograph still hanging on the wall beside the window. Nothing had changed, and everything had changed. Henri sat in the silence and waited for the knock on the door that would signal the end. The knock came at 9:43 in the morning. Henri knew it was 9:43 because he checked his pocket watch, the one accurate timepiece left in a town where every public clock was still lying by 15 minutes. The sound was sharp and authoritative, the kind of knock that carried the weight of official power behind it. Henri stood slowly, crossed the small room and opened the door to find 3 German soldiers standing in the narrow hallway. The officer in front was young, perhaps 25, with the crisp uniform and nervous energy of someone recently promoted beyond his competence. Behind him stood 2 enlisted men with rifles, their faces carefully blank. The officer spoke in heavily accented French, asking if Henri was Henri Bosmans, master clockmaker at the Central Railway Station. Henri confirmed his identity with a voice that sounded surprisingly calm. The officer informed him that there had been an incident, that the station clocks had malfunctioned, that Henri's expertise was required immediately for an investigation. It was not phrased as a request. They did not arrest him immediately, which surprised Henri more than anything else. Instead, they escorted him to the station, walking on either side of him through streets where Belgian civilians watched with carefully neutral expressions. At the station, the scene was controlled chaos. German officers moved through the building with clipboards and measuring instruments, documenting everything, photographing clock faces, interviewing the night shift staff who had been on duty during the collision. Lieutenant Weber sat in the dispatch office looking pale and shaken, answering questions in a monotone voice. Sergeant Kraus stood near the signal control room, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed expression of a man who knew his career had just ended. Henri was led to his workshop on the 2nd floor, where a German technical officer, an older man with engineer's calluses on his hands and steel-rimmed glasses, waited among the scattered tools and clock parts. This man introduced himself as Hauptmann Friedrich Wolf, railway systems specialist, and asked Henri to explain the station's clock synchronization system. Henri explained everything with perfect technical accuracy, walking Hauptmann Wolf through the mechanics of the master clock, the electrical pulse system, the synchronization protocols. He showed the German officer his maintenance logs, his adjustment records, his calibration notes. He answered every question with the detailed precision of a man who had nothing to hide, because the best lies were always built on foundations of truth. Wolf listened carefully, took notes, examined the master clock mechanism in the tower. He measured the pendulum length, checked the regulator weight position, tested the electrical connections. And here Henri held his breath, because if Wolf was truly expert, he would notice the 4mm adjustment in the regulator weight, would see that the pendulum had been deliberately shortened. But Wolf, despite his technical knowledge, was looking for mechanical failure or electrical malfunction, not sabotage. The idea that someone would deliberately adjust a clock to cause a train collision was apparently beyond his imagination. After 2 hours of examination, Wolf concluded that the synchronization system had suffered a spontaneous failure, possibly due to voltage fluctuations in the electrical supply. It was unfortunate, tragic even, but these things happened in wartime when systems were stressed and maintenance was deferred. Henri was released at 2 in the afternoon, with instructions to repair the master clock immediately and submit a detailed report on preventive measures. He walked home through a town that now knew what had happened on the tracks to the east, where rescue crews were still pulling bodies from the wreckage, and German command was trying to explain how two trains on the same line had collided, despite all their precision and protocols. Henri climbed the stairs to his apartment, sat down at his kitchen table, and for the first time since the previous night, allowed himself to feel something approaching relief. They had not caught him. The investigation had concluded it was mechanical failure. He would not be executed at dawn. And in that moment of relief came a realization more terrible than any he had experienced standing on the hill watching men burn. He had gotten away with it, which meant he would have to live with it. The dead would stay dead. The screams would echo forever in his memory, and Henri Bosmans would have to wake up every morning knowing that his hands, the same hands that had crafted beautiful timepieces and repaired delicate mechanisms, had killed 600 men by moving clock hands forward. There would be no punishment, no confession, no absolution, only the weight of knowledge and the question of whether resistance justified the cost. The days following the collision transformed Leuven into a town under siege by its own occupiers. German military police swarmed the station and surrounding areas, conducting interviews, examining records, searching for any hint of sabotage or resistance activity. Henri continued his work, climbing ladders to adjust clocks, oiling mechanisms, maintaining the perfect facade of the compliant craftsman who asked no questions and offered no opinions. He reset the master clock to accurate time, filed his technical report blaming voltage irregularities, and watched as Hauptmann Wolf accepted his conclusions and moved on to other concerns. Lieutenant Weber was reassigned to a desk position in Brussels, his career permanently stained by the disaster that had occurred on his watch. Sergeant Kraus was court-martialed for sleeping on duty, sentenced to 6 months in a military prison, and sent east to serve his time. The German command needed scapegoats to explain the inexplicable, and they found them in human weakness rather than deliberate malice. Henri attended the memorial service the Germans held for their dead soldiers, standing in the back of the crowd with his hat in his hands, watching as officers gave speeches about sacrifice and duty. He felt like a murderer attending his victim's funeral, which was exactly what he was. The crash itself became a strange kind of open secret in Leuven, a disaster that everyone knew about, but no one was permitted to discuss openly. The official German report classified the incident as a tragic accident, resulting from equipment failure and operator error, making no mention of possible sabotage. The wrecked trains were cleared from the tracks within a week, the bodies were shipped back to Germany in sealed coffins, and the railway line was repaired and returned to service. Life under occupation continued as it had before, with curfews and rations and the constant presence of soldiers in grey uniforms. But something had shifted in the town, an almost imperceptible change in the way Belgian civilians carried themselves. They had seen German precision fail spectacularly, had watched the occupiers scramble to explain a disaster that shattered their narrative of absolute control. The collision had not liberated Belgium or changed the outcome of the war, but it had revealed that the machine was not invincible, that even the most regimented system contained vulnerabilities. Henri felt this change most acutely when he walked through the market square and saw the way people looked at him, or more precisely, the way they did not look at him, as if his invisibility had deepened into something more profound. 3 weeks after the collision, Henri received a visitor at his workshop. The man was Belgian, perhaps 30 years old, dressed in worker's clothes and carrying a carpenter's tool bag. He asked Henri to examine a pocket watch that had stopped working, a reasonable request that brought him legitimately into the clockmaker's space. But as Henri opened the watch case and began his examination, the man spoke in a low voice, barely above a whisper. He said he represented certain interested parties who had taken note of the railway incident, who had access to technical analysis that suggested the crash was not entirely accidental, who understood that only someone with intimate knowledge of clock mechanisms could have executed such a plan. Henri's hands froze over the disassembled watch, his heart hammering in his chest. The man continued speaking, saying these interested parties wanted Henri to know that he was not alone, that his actions had struck a significant blow against the occupation, that the disruption to German supply lines had been more substantial than the official reports acknowledged. Then the man placed a small folded paper on the workbench, told Henri the watch was actually fine, and he had been mistaken about the problem, and left the workshop without another word. Henri waited until he was certain the man had left the building before unfolding the paper. It contained no signature, no identifying marks, only a brief message written in careful handwriting. The son of the clockmaker is alive in Stalag 4B near Dresden. The Reich uses his engineering training in their factories. This information comes from a priest who serves that camp and sends you his regards. Your work here has value. More can be done. Henri read the message 3 times, his vision blurring with tears he had not expected. His son was alive. After 3 years of silence and assumed death, his boy was alive, working in a labor camp, surviving. The resistance network, whoever they were, had used resources to find this information and deliver it to Henri as a message of gratitude and encouragement. They wanted him to know that his sacrifice had been witnessed, that he was not a monster acting alone in the darkness, but a soldier in a larger war, and they wanted him to do it again. Henri folded the paper carefully and placed it in his pocket, then sat down at his workbench surrounded by the tools of his trade. Outside, the station clocks ticked in perfect synchronization, their hands moving through time with mechanical certainty, each second bringing the war closer to some unknowable conclusion. Henri spent the next hour staring at the disassembled pocket watch on his bench, not seeing it, thinking instead about choice and consequence and the terrible mathematics of resistance. He had killed 600 men and disrupted a supply line, and the resistance said it had value, said more could be done. But Henri remembered the screams from the burning trains, remembered the shapes moving in the wreckage, remembered the weight of deliberately taking human life, even in service of a righteous cause. Could he do it again? Should he? The answer was not simple, not clean, not reducible to equations of good versus evil. War did not offer clean choices, only terrible ones. And Henri understood now that once you stepped into that darkness, there was no path back to innocence. He could refuse, could return to being invisible, could survive the occupation, and perhaps see his son again when the war finally ended. Or he could accept that his hands, his knowledge, his access to the machinery of the occupation made him a weapon, and weapons were meant to be used. Henri Bosmans, master clockmaker, sat alone in his workshop as afternoon light slanted through the windows, and felt the weight of history pressing down on his shoulders like the hand of a god demanding tribute. The clocks around him continued their lying precision, and Henri knew his answer before he finished asking the question. Henri did not contact the resistance directly, because there was no way to contact them, no address or meeting place or secret handshake that would grant him entry into their shadow world. Instead, he simply continued his work and waited for them to find him again, which they did 6 weeks later when a different messenger, this time a woman delivering laundry to the station, slipped a folded note into his tool bag while he worked on a platform clock. The note contained instructions for a dead drop location, a loose brick in a garden wall 3 streets from his apartment, where he could leave messages and receive responses. The system was elegant in its simplicity, requiring no face-to-face contact, no dangerous meetings, just information passed through hidden spaces in the architecture of the occupied town. Henri used the dead drop twice in the following months, once to pass along detailed schedules of German supply trains that crossed through Leuven, and once to provide technical diagrams of the signal control system that could help other saboteurs understand the vulnerabilities in the railway network. But he did not repeat the clock sabotage, could not bring himself to engineer another collision, could not willingly create another morning where he would stand on a hill and watch men burn because of choices his hands had made. The resistance never pressured him, never demanded more than he was willing to give, seeming to understand that what Henri had done carried a weight that could not be easily borne twice. Instead, they used him as a source of intelligence, mining his technical knowledge and his position within the station to gather information that could be passed to Allied command through channels Henri neither knew nor wanted to know. He learned to observe without appearing to observe, to memorize schedules and cargo manifests, to notice which German officers were careless with security and which routes were most heavily trafficked. The work felt smaller than the collision, less dramatic, but Henri came to understand that resistance was not always about grand gestures of sabotage. Sometimes it was simply about being a thorn that never stopped pressing, a source of friction in the machine, a small persistent failure that accumulated over time into something more significant. He became part of a network he would never fully see, one man among hundreds or perhaps thousands who performed small acts of defiance that collectively degraded the efficiency of the occupation. The war ground on through 1944 with an increasingly desperate quality as Germany found itself crushed between advancing Allied forces in the West and the relentless Soviet push from the East. Henri listened to whispered news from illegal radio broadcasts, tracked the progress of liberation through rumors and the changing demeanor of German soldiers who now looked haunted rather than confident. The railway traffic through Leuven shifted from supply trains heading east to evacuation trains heading west, carrying wounded soldiers and stolen art and high-ranking officers fleeing the approaching front. In September of 1944, Allied forces liberated Brussels, and the sound of artillery could be heard in Leuven as the front line drew closer. The German garrison began preparations for withdrawal, burning documents, packing equipment, destroying anything that might be useful to the advancing armies. Henri watched this dissolution with the detachment of a man who had already spent his emotional capacity and had nothing left to feel. Leuven was liberated on September 3, 1944, by British armoured units that rolled into town, to the cheers of civilians who emerged from their homes waving Belgian flags they had hidden for 4 years. Henri stood in the street outside his apartment and watched the tanks pass, their crews grinning and throwing cigarettes to the crowd, and felt nothing resembling joy or relief. Liberation meant the occupation was over, meant he could stop living in fear of discovery, meant the war in Belgium was effectively finished. But it did not resurrect the 600 men who had died in the collision, did not erase the memory of their screams, did not absolve him of the choices he had made in the service of resistance. The British soldiers who now controlled the station were friendly and grateful, shaking his hand and calling him a hero when they learned from the resistance network about his role in the railway sabotage. They offered him cigarettes and chocolate, and said his actions had disrupted German logistics during a critical phase of the war. Henri accepted their thanks with a polite nod and returned to his workshop, where the clocks continued to tick with mechanical indifference. In the weeks following liberation, Henri submitted a formal request through the International Red Cross to locate his son in the German labor camp system. The response came in November, a brief letter from a Red Cross official in Switzerland informing him that Stalag 4B had been evacuated in August as Soviet forces approached Dresden, and that prisoners had been force-marched west under conditions described as catastrophic. Many prisoners had died during the march, many more had been lost in the chaos of Germany's collapse, and comprehensive records would not be available until the war ended and the camps could be properly catalogued. The letter suggested patience, hope, and prayer. Henri folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with his wife's photograph and the note from the resistance that had told him his son was alive. He did not pray, had not prayed since the occupation began, but he allowed himself to hope in the same way he allowed himself to breathe, as an autonomic function necessary for continued existence but carrying no particular joy. The clocks in the station continued their work, measuring time that moved forward regardless of human suffering, indifferent to liberation or occupation or the quiet desperation of fathers waiting for news of their sons. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, and Henri Bosmans received confirmation of his son's death on June 23rd. The letter came from the Belgian government's repatriation office, a bureaucratic document that explained his son had died during the forced evacuation of Stalag 4B, likely from typhus or starvation, his body buried in an unmarked mass grave somewhere along a road between Dresden and Leipzig. There would be no remains to repatriate, no grave to visit, no final resting place where Henri could leave flowers and speak to the memory of the boy who had once sat at the kitchen table and argued about philosophy and justice. The letter expressed the government's deepest sympathies and noted that his son was classified as a war victim, entitled to official recognition and memorial. Henri read the letter once, placed it in the drawer with his wife's photograph and the resistance note that had given him false hope, and went to work maintaining the station clocks that now served trains carrying refugees, displaced persons and soldiers returning home. The clocks told the truth now, synchronized to accurate time, their mechanisms purged of the lies Henri had once crafted. But the truth they told felt no more meaningful than the lies had been. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Belgium underwent a complex reckoning with collaboration and resistance, and Henri found himself uncomfortably positioned as a minor hero of the underground struggle. Journalists wanted to interview him about the railway sabotage, resistance historians wanted to document his techniques, and the government wanted to award him a medal for actions against the occupation. Henri refused all interviews, declined the medal, and asked only to be left alone to continue his work. The attention made him feel like a fraud, because the journalists and historians spoke about his actions as if they were unambiguously heroic, as if causing a collision that killed 600 men was a simple victory rather than a complex moral catastrophe that he carried in his chest like shrapnel. When pressed to explain his reluctance, Henri told one persistent journalist that heroes were people who saved lives, not people who took them, regardless of whose lives were taken and why. The journalist wrote this down as if it were wisdom rather than the confession of a man who had discovered that righteous violence still felt like violence when you were the one who engineered it. Henri continued working at the Leuven Central Railway Station until 1962, when arthritis in his hands made the fine work of clock repair impossible and he retired on a small pension. He lived alone in his apartment above the bakery, which had resumed making bread after the war, but whose owner never asked Henri for the back rent he had accumulated during the occupation. His days followed a precise routine: morning walks through town, lunch at a small cafe where the owner knew not to engage him in conversation, afternoons reading in his apartment, evenings listening to radio programs that helped fill the silence. He never remarried, never spoke publicly about the collision, and never returned to the hill where he had watched the trains burn. Former members of the resistance occasionally visited him, usually on anniversaries of the liberation, bringing bottles of wine and wanting to share memories of the underground struggle. Henri received them politely, listened to their stories, and offered little of his own. They seemed to remember a different war than the one he had experienced, one where choices were clear and actions were justified, and the cost of resistance was worth the price. Henri envied them their certainty. The true story of the Leuven railway collision remained classified in German military archives for decades after the war, recorded in files that documented technical failures and operator errors but made no mention of sabotage. The families of the dead soldiers were told their sons and husbands had died in a tragic accident, mechanical failure combined with human incompetence, a senseless tragedy of the kind that war produces in abundance. No monument was built, no commemoration held, because acknowledging the disaster would have required acknowledging the vulnerability of systems the Reich had claimed were invincible. The collision faded into footnotes of military logistics reports, a statistical anomaly in the vast machinery of wartime transportation. Only a small number of Belgian resistance members and British intelligence officers who had reviewed the classified documents after the war knew the truth, and they kept it quiet because Henri Bosmans had asked them to. He did not want to be remembered for killing 600 men, even if those men had been serving a genocidal regime. He wanted only to be remembered as a clockmaker who had tried, in his limited way, to resist evil, and had discovered that resistance required a kind of moral courage he was not certain he possessed. Henri Bosmans died in 1973 at the age of 76, alone in his apartment, his body discovered 2 days later by the bakery owner who had noticed his mail accumulating. He left no family, no significant estate, and no written account of what he had done in April of 1943. His funeral was attended by a handful of aging resistance members who remembered him as a quiet hero who had never sought recognition, and by the current station master who knew Henri only as the old clockmaker who had once maintained the railway's timepieces. The story of the collision was not mentioned in his obituary, which described him simply as a craftsman who had lived through the occupation and served his community with dignity. And perhaps that was the truest epitaph, because Henri had learned through terrible experience that history's grand narratives of heroism and resistance were built on the backs of ordinary people making impossible choices in circumstances that offered no good options. He had been a clockmaker who used his knowledge to kill, and he had lived with that knowledge until it finally released him. The clocks he had once maintained continued their work without him, measuring time that moved forward regardless of individual conscience, indifferent to the weight that some men carry and others never have to bear. In the end, Henri Bosmans was simply a man who had opened a door he could never close and who spent the rest of his life wondering if he should have left it locked.